I never expected to notice someone in the quiet hum of a repair shop. Not like this. Maybe it was because my day had been nothing but wires, greasy rags, and the faint smell of burnt circuits. Or maybe it was because the air shifted when she stepped in, like the space had been waiting for her to arrive. I hadn't even looked up when the bell jingled over the door, until I did. She moved with a kind of confidence that made the fluorescent lights seem dim in comparison, mid-40s, but somehow more alive than the faded paint on the walls or the scuffed linoleum underfoot. Her hair was pulled back loosely, a few strands stubbornly escaping, and there was a tilt to her chin that suggested she didn't just walk into rooms, she claimed them. I felt my chest tighten without understanding why. You fix old radios too? Her voice was soft, careful, but there was an edge to it, like she knew she could ask for more than what anyone expected. Yeah? Sometimes. My voice cracked somewhere between casual and nervous, and I immediately regretted it. I wanted to ask her why she was here, why she looked like she had stepped out of some other world into mine, but I froze instead. She smiled, just a little, the kind that doesn't fill the room but makes you want to linger in its shadow. That's good. I've got one from my dad's collection. Been sitting in the attic for years. She tilted her head, watching me fumble with a notepad. I could feel her gaze, steady, assessing, and it was like an electric current running under my skin. I tried to focus on the radio, tracing a finger along the scratched edge, but I kept catching glimpses of her. She moved to a shelf, idly dusting a few old manuals, and I noticed how her hands lingered on the edges, like she was reading not just the titles, but the spaces in between. The way she looked at things made me feel like maybe I was meant to notice them too. There was a pause when I handed her a small screwdriver. Our fingers brushed, briefly, accidentally, but long enough to leave a warmth lingering. She didn't pull away, didn't comment, just kept holding it, her thumb brushing the metal in a careless, almost intimate way. I pulled my hand back too quickly, embarrassed, but I couldn't stop staring. "You're careful," she said, almost to herself, and then, softer. "I like that." I laughed awkwardly. "Careful's, my middle name." It came out forced, but she didn't laugh. She tilted her head, the corner of her mouth lifting like she was amused by something only she understood. And then she said nothing, just smiled again, eyes scanning the workshop, and my stomach sank with the ridiculous thought that I'd been caught staring, yet relieved that she hadn't called me out. I noticed the subtle scent of her perfume, faint, woody, a little spicy. Nothing overpowering, but enough to make the space between us feel smaller. My hands itched to do something, anything, but my words refused to form. So we stayed like that, standing a few feet apart, a silence that felt louder than any conversation. I didn't know her. Not really. And yet, somehow, every small movement, every glance, every brush of fingers made it feel like I had already noticed her forever. She was out there in the world, a tangle of confidence and quiet edges, and I was just here, waiting to see what would happen next. When she finally turned back to the radio, adjusting the dial with a practiced hand, I couldn't stop thinking about the tilt of her head, the way her eyes lingered just a second too long. I didn't know what it meant. I didn't even want to know yet, but I knew I wouldn't forget it. Not ever. The next time she showed up, it wasn't just a bell over the door that made my heart lurch. It was the certainty that she was about to step back into the small orbit I hadn't asked for but couldn't escape. She carried a box of tools this time, the kind that looked heavy for anyone, but she held it like it was nothing. "I thought I could fix it myself," she said, setting it down on the workbench with a faint sigh. "But, well, I realized I'm better at knowing when to ask for help." Her voice held a hesitation I hadn't noticed before, subtle, almost fragile. She brushed a loose strand of hair behind her ear, a little too carefully, like she didn't want me to see the small tremor in her hands. I knelt beside the table, sorting screws into a tray. I noticed everything. The small scar on her wrist, the way her nails were slightly chipped, the tiny crease between her eyebrows that appeared when she concentrated. It made her seem human, vulnerable in a way that pulled at something inside me. I felt the urge to reach out, to steady her hands, but I froze. "So, you come here often?" I asked, trying to sound casual, though my pulse was racing. She looked up, eyes catching mine, and there was a pause, a fraction of a second where she seemed to weigh what she could reveal. Not really. I don't usually ask people to do things for me. The words landed with more weight than she intended, and I could see her shoulders tighten. She was used to handling everything herself, and yet here she was, leaning, ever so slightly, on me. I swallowed, trying to keep my own excitement quiet. She laughed softly when a screw slipped out of her fingers and clattered across the bench. It wasn't a loud laugh, just a quiet sound that lingered, like smoke in the room, making the air feel warmer, denser. I caught her eyes again as she stooped to retrieve it, and I thought, if I looked any closer, would she notice how much I was noticing her? She set the screw back with care, exhaling in a way that suggested fatigue, though she'd only been here a few minutes. "I'm sorry," she murmured. "I know this is probably silly, me asking for help." I shook my head. Not silly. Really not. I didn't add that I'd been waiting for it, in a way I'd never admit aloud. We worked side by side in silence after that, but it wasn't empty. I watched the subtle movements, how her fingers lingered on the edge of the radio, how she shifted her weight from one foot to the other, how her jaw tightened when she focused. Every small detail felt magnified, charged, like there was a hidden current flowing between us. Then, without warning, she looked up and caught me staring, and for a heartbeat, the air thickened. Her eyes softened, and she gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, like an acknowledgement of something unspoken. I felt my chest tighten. There was no rush, no grand declaration, just the quiet pull of something forbidden, something tentative but undeniably present. As she turned back to her work, I noticed her shoulders slump slightly, exhaustion and trust mingling in a way that made the space between us feel intimate, even though we hadn't said much at all. I wanted to reach for her, to touch that moment, but I didn't. I just kept my eyes on her, memorizing every line, every tremor, every laugh, and I wondered how long I could hold back before this quiet gravity pulled us closer. And when she brushed past me to grab another tool, our fingers barely grazing, a spark ran up my arm that neither of us acknowledged, but both of us felt. It was late, later than usual, and the shop smelled faintly of ozone and rain. Outside, a sudden storm rattled the windows, the first loud drops making the floorboards vibrate beneath our feet. She stayed longer than expected. Leaning over the radio I was helping her fix, her hair damp from the drizzle that had followed her in. "You should probably go home," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, though my pulse had jumped at how close she was. She barely looked up, her fingers brushing mine as she adjusted a wire. The contact was fleeting, but my skin remembered it long after it ended. "I don't want to," she said softly, almost a whisper, and I caught a flicker of hesitation in her eyes. It was that small, impossible moment where everything between us felt too loud, yet nothing was said. I wanted to speak, to tell her something I couldn't even name, but the words lodged in my throat. I noticed the way her shoulders hunched slightly, the fatigue in her movements, the quiet sigh she tried to hide. She wasn't showing vulnerability outright, but it was there, layered beneath the careful exterior. I wanted to reach out, to steady her, to bridge the space between caution and trust, but I held back. The storm's rhythm was a backdrop to the tension in the room. Each crack of thunder made me flinch, not entirely at the noise. And then my phone buzzed on the counter. I glanced down. It wasn't mine, it was hers. A name flashed across the screen. Her ex. She glanced at it too, a brief frown crossing her face before she silenced it. "I should probably answer that," she said, her fingers hovering over the screen. There was something in her tone, resignation, irritation, maybe a little fear, that made my chest tighten. She was used to handling everything, and I wanted to be part of it, but I wasn't supposed to. Not yet. Instead, she let it go. She turned back to the radio, just a little too quickly, as if trying to hide the tension in her expression. I caught my own reflection in the glass casing of an old speaker, my jaw tight, my hands trembling slightly despite myself. Every fiber of me wanted to say something, do something, anything to break the carefully drawn line between us. She brushed past me again, this time to grab a screwdriver. and the motion was so close I could feel the warmth of her sleeve against my arm. Neither of us spoke. My mind screamed, and yet my body obeyed restraint. It was like standing on the edge of something I didn't know I was ready to leap into, but already longing for. Her eyes flicked to mine for the briefest instant, a shared acknowledgement, electric and impossible to ignore. For a heartbeat, I thought she might reach out, touch my arm, lean closer. Maybe confess a truth I wasn't ready to hear. Maybe let her guard fall entirely. But then a crack of thunder startled her, and she pulled back just enough to shatter the moment. We worked side by side in silence for the next few minutes, but the air between us was charged in a way that neither words nor tools could dispel. Every glance, every brush of fingers, every exhalation felt like a secret we were both keeping. And as she finally gathered her things to leave, I watched her hesitate at the door, hand on the handle, as if she wanted, almost, to turn back. Almost, but not quite. I stayed still, letting her go, but I couldn't stop thinking about that suspended second, that spark we both felt and denied. And I knew, somehow, it wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The shop was quieter than usual that evening, the storm from earlier reduced to a soft drizzle tapping against the windows. I was sorting screws when I realized she hadn't spoken in nearly 10 minutes, her gaze fixed somewhere beyond the workbench, distant but tense. I cleared my throat, trying to break the silence, but the words felt trivial. "You okay?" I asked, and it came out softer than I intended, almost a whisper. She turned toward me slowly, eyes sharp but tired, and I realized she had been holding something in. "Do you ever wonder if we're doing the wrong thing?" Her voice trembled slightly, fragile but steady enough to cut through the quiet. I froze. The words weren't about us, exactly. Or maybe they were. She didn't lean in, didn't touch me, yet the weight of what she'd said pressed against my chest. I wanted to argue, to make light of it, but even my thoughts felt heavy. What do you mean?" I asked, careful, because I knew she wouldn't repeat it. She exhaled, almost a shudder, and turned away to hide the tension in her jaw. "I mean this. Being here. Being with someone. Not like anyone else. Not normal. I don't know why it feels like a secret, or why it matters so much." Her fingers drummed on the workbench, slow and deliberate, like punctuation to words she couldn't fully say. I watched her, noticing again the small details, the way her sleeves bunched around her wrists, the faint shadow under her eyes, the tiny crease of worry between her brows. Every micro-behavior spoke louder than words, and I wanted desperately to tell her it was okay, that I understood, that I felt the same way, but the words wouldn't form. Instead, I moved a little closer, careful, not to invade, just to be present. She didn't look at me, but I could feel her awareness of me, the tension in her shoulders, the way her breath hitched slightly when I shifted my weight. "What are we doing?" she asked finally, quieter this time, almost a plea. The question was simple, but it felt like the weight of the room, of everything unspoken between us, pressed into it. I didn't answer. I couldn't. Every rational part of me said I should, but every raw, desperate part of me was trapped, unable to untangle the words from the ache in my chest. So I just watched, letting her voice hang in the air, letting the silence speak back in kind. She exhaled sharply, leaning against the bench, and the subtle tremor in her hands gave her away. She was human, she was fragile, and she was trying not to collapse under the weight of what we both knew but refused to name. I wanted to bridge the gap, to put a hand on hers, to say something that would anchor us both, but I didn't. I stayed still, holding myself back, because I knew some confessions couldn't be rushed, and some truths were dangerous to speak too soon. Her eyes flicked toward mine, searching, desperate, and in that look I understood everything and nothing all at once. She swallowed hard, lips pressed together, and for the first time, I felt that our dynamic had shifted. Pretending this was normal was no longer possible. Then she whispered, almost to herself, almost to the room, almost as if she were afraid I would hear. "I don't think I've ever wanted something this much, and been this terrified of it." The words landed, heavy and raw, and I felt the space between us constrict, charged, impossible to ignore. And just like that, The silence we'd both leaned on became a confession neither of us was ready to name. I was cleaning up the workbench when she set a small envelope in front of me. It wasn't marked, just a plain, slightly crumpled piece of stationery. Her hands lingered on the edges as if letting go too quickly would make the moment vanish. "I found this the other day," she said, voice low, careful. "I wasn't sure I should even open it, but I think you should see it." I hesitated, unsure if she meant me to read it, or if it was just a way to keep herself busy while she tried to explain something too big for words. She watched me, a quiet intensity in her eyes, like she was bracing herself for the fall. I opened it slowly. Inside was a photograph, aged, slightly yellowed at the edges. She was younger in the picture, smiling with someone whose presence seemed to echo in the corners of her eyes. I didn't recognize the man immediately, but something in her gaze made my chest tighten. "That was my husband," she said softly, barely above a whisper. Her voice trembled, a small quiver that betrayed the calm she usually carried so effortlessly. He passed a few years ago. I never really talk about it. It's just there, always there." I felt a strange weight settle over me, not sadness exactly, but the gravity of her memory pressing against my chest. I didn't know what to say. How do you respond to someone revealing a loss that shaped the way they exist in the world? "I remember you mentioning a brother once," I said carefully. "But this is different. It's more." She nodded, looking down at the photograph again. Her fingers traced the edges of the image like she could somehow feel him again. "It's more," she admitted. "And I think part of me was afraid of losing someone else. Afraid of letting anyone close. And then, you showed up." Her eyes flicked to mine, searching for judgment, for understanding, for something I couldn't name. I didn't move, didn't speak. Instead, I felt a pulse in my chest, an ache that wasn't mine alone but belonged to her and the absence she carried. The moment was quiet, almost unbearable, and yet I didn't want to break it. Some things are too delicate for words. "You didn't know," she said finally, almost to herself, and I shook my head. "I didn't think I could tell you. I didn't even know if I wanted to." Her honesty, so simple, so human, shifted something between us. I felt the slow, almost imperceptible tug of closeness, not desire yet, not even trust fully, but an acknowledgement that we were no longer strangers, no longer operating in careful distance. She exhaled sharply, the tension in her shoulders easing just a fraction. "I just wanted you to see her, to understand why I am this way." I looked at her, at the photograph, at the way her hands shook slightly, and I realized how much weight she had been carrying quietly, alone. And somehow, in that soft, tremulous revelation, the world seemed to tilt. Not loudly, not dramatically, but enough to make the air between us feel different, electric and fragile. She looked at me, eyes glistening, and for a heartbeat, I thought she might say something else, something that would shatter the careful walls we'd built. But she didn't. She just let the silence stretch, letting me feel everything she hadn't said in words. And in that stillness, I realized I couldn't stop thinking about her. Not just her presence, but the parts she'd held back, the quiet storms she'd survived, the fragility beneath her strength. And then, without warning, her hand brushed mine, not by accident, not in play, but with the barest touch, enough to make my heart lurch. It was soft, but seismic. We didn't talk much that evening. The storm had faded into a steady drizzle, leaving the shop quiet except for the occasional drip from the roof. She sat on the edge of the workbench, knees drawn slightly inward, and I leaned against the counter nearby, pretending to organize tools, but really watching her. There was no rush, no words to force the moment. Just the soft hum of fluorescent lights and the faint scent of rain on asphalt. She tilted her head, brushing a damp strand of hair behind her ear, and for a moment, I thought she might look away, but she didn't. She stayed there, present, almost waiting for me to do the same. She began, then stopped, exhaling. She wasn't confessing love, not aloud, not even wanting to. It was something quieter, something slower, something earned. Her eyes met mine, and in that glance, I felt the weight of all the previous moments, the hesitations, the sparks, the near confessions, settle into something that didn't need words. I stepped closer, careful, almost shy despite everything I'd felt for her over weeks. My hand hovered, uncertain, and finally rested lightly over hers. She didn't pull away. She didn't even react at first, just let it rest there. A simple connection that held decades of restraint and quiet longing in a single touch. Feels like we've been circling this forever, she murmured, voice low, almost a thought she was sharing with herself. I nodded, fingers brushing hers lightly, slow enough to notice the small tremble in her hand. Yeah, I said. No declarations, no promises, just acknowledgement. Sometimes that's all you need. Sometimes all the words in the world would ruin what's already here. We stayed like that for a while. I could feel her exhale, subtle but grounding, and it reminded me that this wasn't sudden or reckless. It had been a slow accumulation of glances, touches, silences, and honesty. The kind of connection that comes only when two people allow themselves to be fully seen, flaws and all. She leaned back slightly, and I mirrored her subtly, creating a shared space where neither of us had to speak. The quiet between us wasn't empty. It was full of all the things we had yet to say, all the confessions we didn't need to voice. Then, just before she rose to leave, she shifted and pressed her forehead briefly to my shoulder. A fleeting, almost imperceptible gesture, but it carried everything the previous weeks had built: trust, recognition, patience, and an unspoken decision to let this continue, however slowly, however imperfectly. I didn't move. I let her stay, holding her there, letting the moment breathe. And for the first time, it felt inevitable. Not because we said it, but because we allowed it. Because we had weathered hesitation, storm, and the quiet ache of unspoken emotions. When she finally pulled back, she didn't speak. Neither did I. And the silence, this time, wasn't charged with tension or longing. It was full, complete, the kind of quiet that says everything without a single word. I watched her leave, then sat down on the edge of the workbench she had just vacated, my hand lingering where hers had been. And I realized something simple, undeniable. Some things don't need a confession to be real. Some things just are. Looking back, I don't remember a single grand moment that defined us. There wasn't a confession shouted in the rain, or a dramatic declaration under flickering lights. What I remember is the quiet, those tiny, almost invisible decisions, the seconds where our hands brushed, the way she let herself be seen in fragments, and I learned to see without demanding more. She's changed, I think. Not in the obvious ways. She's still confident, still guarded, but softer around the edges, willing to let someone share the weight of her world, even if just a little. I see it in the way she laughs now, full and unself-conscious, and the subtle way she trusts me to notice the small things, the scars, the tiredness, the fleeting expressions that reveal her underneath the careful exterior. I've changed too, in ways I hadn't expected. I've learned to pause, to hold myself back, to watch and wait and appreciate someone without needing to claim them outright. I've discovered that longing can be quiet, patient, and that desire doesn't always have to rush to fulfillment to be meaningful. I've learned that noticing someone, truly noticing, can be as powerful as any spoken word. Love, I've realized, isn't always a lightning strike or a cinematic embrace. Sometimes it's a slow unfolding, an accumulation of glances and silences and shared burdens. It's learning the rhythms of another person's hesitations, understanding the history they carry, and showing up anyway. It's small, imperfect, human, and somehow enough. I think about that night, the one where she pressed her forehead to my shoulder. Not dramatic, not the kind of moment that would make a movie real. Just a gesture, and yet it felt like everything. That small, fleeting touch held years of restraint, weeks of tension, months of unspoken longing, and somehow it made the future seem possible, patient, unhurried. Sometimes I wonder if she even remembers all the small moments that defined us, the almost glances, the silences, the quiet acknowledgments. I do. I remember every one, because each one was a choice, a decision to let someone in without giving everything away. And that, I think, is the truest form of connection we ever had. We're still learning, still navigating, still human in all the ways that matter. But now, there's trust beneath the uncertainty, patience beneath the desire, and a kind of quiet joy in simply being together, without needing to rush or fix or name it. And as I sit here, remembering, I can't help but smile. Not because it was perfect, but because it was ours, messy, flawed, beautiful in its restraint. If this story made you feel something, let me know in the comments. Would you want more stories like this?